The morning of June 10, 1912, dawned quiet in Villisca, Iowa. Too quiet. Mary Peckman stood on her front porch at 508 East 2nd Street, her eyes fixed on the house directly across from her. The Moore family home, usually alive with the sounds of children's laughter and Josiah Moore's booming voice calling out morning greetings, sat in complete silence. Something was wrong. Mary had noticed it immediately when she stepped outside to collect her morning milk delivery. The Moore house, with its white clapboard siding and neat front porch, looked exactly as it had the night before. Curtains drawn tight, windows shuttered against the world. But it was past 8 o'clock, and the Moores were early risers. Josiah should have been heading to his hardware store by now. Sarah should have been hanging laundry or tending to her garden. The children should have been playing in the yard. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over the property like a shroud. No smoke curled from the kitchen chimney. The family's chickens wandered aimlessly in their pen, unfed. Even the Moore's dog seemed subdued, lying motionless near the front steps. Mary Peckman wasn't the only neighbor to notice. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, had grown increasingly concerned as the morning progressed. He'd stopped by the house twice, knocking loudly on both the front and back doors. No response. The doors were locked, unusual for a family that typically kept their home open to neighbors and friends. At 508 East 2nd Street, the Moore family had built what seemed to be an ideal life. Josiah, 43, was a successful businessman and pillar of the community. His hardware store thrived, and his reputation for honesty and hard work had earned him respect throughout Montgomery County. Sarah, 39, was beloved for her gentle nature and dedication to her 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and little Paul, just 5 years old. But the house that had been filled with warmth and laughter just hours before now radiated something else entirely, a suffocating sense of dread that seemed to seep through its very walls. The last time anyone had seen the Moore family alive was the previous evening at the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church. Sarah had volunteered to help with the program, and the children had performed beautifully. The family had stayed afterward for the social hour, chatting with friends and neighbors. They'd seemed happy, relaxed, a picture of small-town contentment. 2 other children had accompanied them home that night. Lena and Ina Stillinger, ages 12 and 8, daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger. The girls had been invited for a sleepover, a common occurrence in the close-knit community where children often stayed with neighboring families. 6 children, 2 adults, 8 souls who had gone to sleep in safety and peace. As the sun climbed higher over Villisca, casting longer shadows across the Moore property, Mary Peckman made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would cross the street and see for herself why the house remained so unnaturally quiet. She had no way of knowing that behind those drawn curtains lay a scene of such brutal violence that it would terrorize a nation and spawn a mystery that would endure for more than a century. She couldn't have imagined that the silence she found so disturbing was the silence of death, violent, senseless death that had visited this peaceful home in the darkest hours of the night. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, innocent fragrances that would soon be forever tainted by the discovery that awaited. In just minutes, Mary Peckman would become the first person to peer through the windows of what newspapers would soon call the House of Horror. But for now, there was only the silence, heavy, oppressive, and absolute. The Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street had always been more than just a home. It was a symbol of the American dream realized. Built in the late 1800s, the modest 2-story structure represented everything Josiah Moore had worked to achieve since arriving in Villisca as a young man with nothing but ambition and determination. The house itself was unremarkable by today's standards, but in 1912 rural Iowa, it spoke of prosperity and respectability. White clapboard siding, a welcoming front porch, and well-maintained grounds marked the Moore family as successful members of Villisca's upper middle class. Inside, the home reflected Sarah's careful attention to detail: lace curtains, polished furniture, and family photographs arranged with loving precision. But beneath this veneer of small-town perfection, darker currents had begun to flow through the Moore family's life in the months leading up to that fateful June night. Josiah Moore was not without his enemies. a reality that would later fuel countless theories about who might have wanted him dead. His business success had come at a cost. The hardware store that provided the family's comfortable lifestyle had also created professional rivalries that simmered beneath Villisca's polite social surface. Frank Fernando Jones, a wealthy local businessman and state senator, had once been Moore's employer and mentor. Their relationship had soured dramatically when Moore left Jones's hardware store to establish his own competing business just down the street. The competition between the two men had grown increasingly bitter. Moore had successfully wooed away several of Jones's key customers, and whispers around town suggested that Jones harbored deep resentment toward his former protege. Some claimed to have overheard Jones making threats, though he would later vehemently deny any involvement in the Moore family's fate. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The social fabric of Villisca in 1912 was tightly woven, and secrets had a way of becoming public knowledge. Rumors circulated about Moore's wandering eye, whispered suggestions that his marriage to Sarah wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Some townspeople claimed to have seen him paying inappropriate attention to young women, including daughters of family friends. These allegations would later take on sinister significance as investigators tried to understand who might have harbored enough rage to commit such an unthinkable act. Sarah Moore, by all accounts, was aware of the tensions surrounding her husband's business dealings, but she chose to focus on her children and her community involvement. She was active in the Presbyterian Church, helped organize social events, and was known for her kindness to neighbors in need. Yet, even Sarah couldn't escape the undercurrents of small-town gossip and rivalry that swirled around the Moore family. The children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were blissfully unaware of the adult complexities that shadowed their lives. They attended the local school, played with neighborhood friends, and participated in church activities with the innocent enthusiasm of childhood. Herman, the eldest at 11, had begun showing signs of his father's business acumen, often helping at the hardware store after school. Catherine was known for her sweet singing voice, which had been showcased at the previous evening's Children's Day service. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, who had joined the Moore children for that final sleepover, came from a similarly respectable family. Their father, Joseph Stillinger, worked as a locomotive engineer, and their mother, Sarah, was active in the same social circles as Sarah Moore. The girls' presence in the house that night was nothing unusual. Sleepovers were common occurrences in Villisca's tight-knit community. As June 10, 1912, had dawned over this seemingly peaceful household, the house had already been transformed into something unrecognizable. The comfortable bedrooms where children had dreamed of summer adventures had become chambers of horror. The parlor where the family had entertained guests just days before had been violated by an unspeakable presence. The killer had moved through these rooms with methodical precision, understanding the layout well enough to navigate in darkness. This familiarity would later fuel theories that the murderer was someone known to the family, perhaps even someone who had been welcomed into this very house as a guest. But now, as Mary Peckman approached the front door with growing concern, none of these dark undercurrents were visible. The house looked exactly as it always had, neat, respectable, quintessentially American. Only the unnatural silence betrayed the truth that lay waiting inside. The clock in the Moore family parlor had stopped at 2:17 a.m. on June 10, 1912, a detail that would later haunt investigators and fuel decades of speculation about the precise timing of the massacre that unfolded within those walls. Sometime after midnight, while Villisca slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, a killer had entered the Moore home with murder on their mind. The weapon of choice was an axe, Josiah Moore's own axe, taken from the woodshed behind the house. The irony was as brutal as the crime itself. The tool that had helped Moore provide for his family would become the instrument of their destruction. The killer's approach was methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly silent. They moved through the house with the confidence of someone who knew its layout intimately. The first victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore, asleep in their downstairs bedroom. The attack came without warning, without mercy, without the chance for either parent to cry out or defend their children. Josiah Moore, the respected businessman who had built his family's comfortable life through hard work and determination, died in his sleep. The axe blade fell with devastating force, crushing his skull in a single, powerful blow. Sarah, lying beside her husband of 16 years, suffered the same fate. Their deaths were swift, brutal, and final. But the killer's work was far from finished. Moving with deadly purpose up the narrow staircase, the murderer continued their grisly task. In the children's bedroom, Herman Moore, just 11 years old and full of dreams about following in his father's footsteps, was killed as he slept. His younger siblings, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul, met the same horrific end. Each child was struck down in their bed, their young lives snuffed out before they could comprehend the evil that had invaded their sanctuary. The two Stillinger girls, guests in what should have been a safe haven, were murdered in the spare bedroom where they had bedded down for the night. 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina, who had spent their final evening laughing and playing with their friends, became the final victims of a killer whose motives remained as dark and impenetrable as the night itself. 8 lives extinguished in a matter of minutes. 8 souls who had gone to sleep in peace and security, never to wake again. The speed and efficiency of the murders suggested either incredible rage or cold, calculated planning, possibly both. But the killer's actions after the murders revealed a disturbing psychology that would puzzle investigators for generations. Rather than fleeing immediately, the murderer had lingered in the house, engaging in bizarre rituals that spoke to a deeply disturbed mind. Every mirror in the house was covered, draped with clothing, towels, or sheets. This detail would later spawn countless theories about the killer's identity and psychological state. Some experts suggested it indicated guilt or shame. Others believed it reflected superstition or mental illness. The covered mirrors became one of the case's most haunting and inexplicable elements. The killer had also searched through the house methodically, though nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken. Drawers were opened, papers scattered, but Sarah's jewelry remained untouched, and Josiah's money was left undisturbed. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something far more sinister and personal. In a final act of grotesque theatricality, the murderer had placed a slab of bacon on the floor near the kitchen. Some investigators theorized this was meant as an insult or message. Others believed it might have been used to muffle sounds during the killings. The bacon, like so many other details of the crime, would never be adequately explained. The weapon itself, the blood-stained axe, was found leaning casually against the wall in the guest bedroom where the Stillinger girls had been killed. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints, suggesting a killer who understood the importance of evidence, yet it was left behind like a calling card. As dawn broke over Villisca on June 10th, the killer had vanished into the morning light, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would shock the nation. The house that had been filled with love, laughter, and the innocent dreams of childhood had been transformed into a charnel house that would become synonymous with one of America's most baffling unsolved crimes. 8 innocent people had paid the ultimate price for someone's twisted vengeance or uncontrolled rage. The question that would torment investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths for more than a century was simple yet impossibly complex. Who could have committed such an unspeakable act, and why? Mary Peckman's hand trembled as she reached for the Moore family's front door handle at 8 a.m. on June 10, 1912. The silence that had troubled her all morning now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. When the door refused to budge, locked from the inside, her concern deepened into genuine alarm. Stepping off the front porch, Mary made her way around the house, peering through windows where gaps in the drawn curtains allowed glimpses inside. What she saw through the parlor window stopped her heart cold. In the dim morning light filtering through the fabric, she could make out the still form of Josiah Moore lying on the floor, his head covered in blood. Mary Peckman's scream shattered the morning quiet of East 2nd Street. Within minutes, neighbors began gathering. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived first, followed by Villisca's city marshal, Hank Horton. The marshal, a man more accustomed to dealing with drunk and disorderly conduct than violent crime, approached the house with visible apprehension. The locked doors and drawn curtains suggested whoever had committed this atrocity might still be inside. Marshal Horton called out, identifying himself and demanding that anyone inside surrender. The only response was the same unnatural silence that had troubled Mary Peckman hours earlier. using an axe of his own, an irony that would haunt him for years. Horton broke down the kitchen door and stepped into what newspapers would soon describe as a scene from hell itself. The smell hit him first, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something else, something that spoke of violence and death. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, lit only by thin streams of sunlight penetrating the covered windows, the full horror of the scene revealed itself. Josiah Moore lay in a pool of congealed blood in the parlor, his skull crushed so severely that identification was only possible by his clothing. Sarah Moore was discovered in their bedroom, her nightgown soaked crimson, her gentle face obliterated by the force of repeated axe blows. But it was the discovery upstairs that broke even hardened men to tears. The 4 more children and their 2 young guests lay in their beds as if peacefully sleeping, except for the horrific wounds that had ended their lives. Little Paul Moore, only 5 years old, clutched a toy in his small hand. Catherine still wore the white dress she had planned to put on for school the next day. Marshall Horton, overwhelmed by the carnage, immediately sent for Dr. J. Clark Cooper, the county coroner, and contacted Sheriff Jackson of Montgomery County. Word spread through Villisca with the speed that only shocking news can travel in a small town. By noon, hundreds of curious onlookers had gathered outside the Moore house, straining to catch glimpses of the scene that would forever change their quiet community. Dr. Cooper's preliminary examination revealed the systematic nature of the killings. Each victim had suffered severe head trauma from what appeared to be the same weapon, an axe that had been wielded with devastating force. The killer had struck each victim multiple times, far beyond what would have been necessary to cause death, suggesting either uncontrolled rage or a methodical desire to ensure no one could survive to identify the murderer. The discovery of the axe leaning against the wall in the guest bedroom sent chills through the assembled investigators. It was Josiah Moore's own tool, taken from his woodshed and used against his family with calculated cruelty. The weapon had been carefully cleaned, but traces of blood and hair still clung to its blade, evidence that would later prove frustratingly inconclusive in an era before sophisticated forensic analysis. As news of the massacre spread beyond Villisca, reporters from across Iowa and neighboring states began converging on the small town. The story had everything that captured public attention. A prosperous family destroyed in their sleep, innocent children murdered in their beds, and a killer who had vanished without leaving so much as a clear footprint. The Moore house became a macabre tourist attraction almost immediately. Despite law enforcement's attempts to secure the scene, hundreds of people trampled through the rooms where the family had died, contaminating evidence and satisfying their morbid curiosity. Souvenir hunters chipped paint from the walls and took fragments of bloodstained wood, turning the crime scene into a carnival of the grotesque. By evening, the bodies of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls had been removed to the local undertaker, but the questions surrounding their deaths had only begun to multiply. Who could have harbored enough hatred to destroy an entire family? How had the killer moved so silently through the house? And perhaps most disturbing of all, were the residents of Villisca safe in their own beds? The discovery that shook Iowa on that June morning would soon capture the attention of the entire nation, spawning investigations, trials, and theories that would persist for more than a century. The scene inside 508 East 2nd Street defied comprehension. As investigators began their grim work on the afternoon of June 10, 1912, the full extent of the killer's brutality became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't merely murder. It was systematic annihilation carried out with a precision that spoke to either meticulous planning or uncontrolled psychotic rage. Dr. J. Clark Cooper, the Montgomery County coroner, had seen death in many forms during his medical career, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited inside the Moore house. Each victim bore wounds far exceeding what would have been necessary to cause death. The killer had continued striking long after life had fled, turning murder into mutilation. Josiah Moore's injuries were particularly severe. The successful businessman who had greeted neighbors with friendly waves just hours before was now unrecognizable, his skull fractured in multiple places by at least 6 separate blows. The force of the attacks had been so violent that fragments of bone and brain matter had splattered across the parlor walls, creating a gruesome tableau that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Sarah Moore had suffered similar devastation. The gentle woman who had spent her final evening helping with the church's Children's Day program lay in her bedroom, her nightgown saturated with blood. The killer had shown no mercy for her gender or her innocence, striking with the same methodical brutality that had characterized each murder. But it was the condition of the children that broke the hardest hearts among the investigators. Herman Moore, just 11 and full of boyish dreams, had been killed in his bed with such force that his pillow was soaked through with blood. Catherine, whose sweet voice had delighted the church congregation just hours before, lay still clutching the corner of her sheet. Boyd and little Paul, ages 7 and 5 respectively, appeared almost peaceful except for the horrible wounds that had ended their young lives. The Stillinger girls presented perhaps the most disturbing scene of all. Lena, at 12, showed signs that she might have awakened during the attack. Her body was positioned differently from the others, suggesting she had tried to flee or defend herself. The thought that at least one victim had been conscious during the nightmare would torment investigators and the girl's family for years to come. The killer's behavior after the murders revealed a psychological profile that was both fascinating and terrifying to early criminologists. The systematic covering of every mirror in the house suggested a killer who couldn't bear to see their own reflection, or perhaps believed in the superstition that mirrors trapped the souls of the dead. Clothing, towels, and sheets had been draped over every reflective surface, transforming the house into a shrouded tomb. The searcher had been methodical, but not greedy. Drawers throughout the house had been opened and their contents scattered, yet nothing of significant value had been taken. Sarah's jewelry remained untouched in her dresser. Josiah's money was still in his wallet. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far more personal and infinitely more sinister. The mysterious slab of bacon found on the kitchen floor became one of the case's most puzzling elements. Some investigators theorized it had been used to muffle sounds during the killings, pressed against victims' faces to prevent screams. Others believed it was a calling card or symbol with meaning known only to the killer. The bacon, like so many other details, would spawn countless theories but yield no definitive answers. The axe itself told a story of calculated violence. Josiah Moore's own tool, taken from the woodshed behind the house, had been wielded with devastating effectiveness. The killer had known exactly where to find the weapon, suggesting familiarity with the family's daily routines and property layout. After completing the murders, the axe had been carefully cleaned and left leaning against the wall in the guest bedroom, a final, chilling signature. Blood evidence painted a picture of systematic movement through the house. Investigators could trace the killer's path from the master bedroom through the kitchen and up to the children's rooms. Footprints in blood suggested someone of average height and build, but the evidence had been contaminated by the dozens of curiosity seekers who had trampled through the scene before it could be properly secured. As word of the massacre spread beyond Villisca, the small town found itself thrust into a spotlight it never wanted. Newspaper headlines screamed of the Iowa Axe Murders and the Villisca horror. Reporters descended like vultures, interviewing anyone who would speak about the Moore family and speculating wildly about possible motives and suspects. The dream that Josiah and Sarah Moore had built, their comfortable home, their thriving business, their 4 beloved children, lay shattered in pools of blood and scattered memories. The house that had once echoed with laughter and the sounds of family life now stood as a monument to humanity's capacity for inexplicable evil. Within hours of the discovery, suspicion fell on 3 men whose names would become forever linked to the Villisca murders, each representing a different theory about what could drive someone to commit such an unthinkable act. The investigations that followed would destroy reputations, tear apart families, and expose the dark underbelly of small-town America. The first suspect emerged from the very church where the Moore family had spent their final evening. Reverend George Jacobs Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister who had delivered a sermon at the Children's Day service, had left Villisca on the midnight train shortly after the program ended. His hasty departure, combined with his erratic behavior during the evening, immediately drew suspicion from investigators. Kelly was a man whose appearance matched the sinister nature of the crime. Tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes and a wild shock of dark hair, he looked like something from a Gothic nightmare. Those who had interacted with him that Sunday evening described his behavior as strange, almost manic. He had lingered after the church service, making inappropriate comments about the Moore children and paying particular attention to the young Stillinger girls. Detective James Newton Wilkerson of the Burns International Detective Agency, brought in to investigate the case, became convinced that Kelly was their man. The Reverend had a history of mental instability and had been dismissed from previous ministerial positions for disturbing behavior. More damning still, similar axe murders had occurred in other towns where Kelly had preached, creating what investigators believed was a pattern of religious mania and violence. But Kelly wasn't the only suspect who captured investigators' attention. Frank Fernando Jones, the wealthy businessman and state senator who had been Josiah Moore's former employer and bitter rival, found himself under intense scrutiny. The business feud between the two men had grown increasingly acrimonious, and Jones had allegedly been overheard making threats against Moore. Jones possessed both motive and means. As a prominent member of Villisca society, he would have had intimate knowledge of the Moore family's routines and house layout. His wealth and political connections also gave him the resources to potentially hire someone to carry out the murders if he lacked the stomach for the deed himself. Whispers around town suggested that Jones's hatred for Moore had festered into something murderous. The third suspect was perhaps the most enigmatic, William Blackie Mansfield, a known criminal and drifter who had been spotted in the Villisca area around the time of the murders. Mansfield was a cocaine addict with a history of violence and burglary. Unlike the respectable Kelly and Jones, he represented the kind of dangerous outsider that small-town residents instinctively feared. Mansfield had been seen by several witnesses near the Moore house in the days leading up to the murders, allegedly casing the property. His appearance, dark-skinned, shifty-eyed, and dressed in the rough clothing of a transient, made him an easy target for suspicion in an era when strangers were viewed with automatic distrust. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him peering through the Moore family's windows, earning him the moniker the Peeping Tom in local gossip. Each suspect represented a different facet of America's fears in 1912. Kelly embodied the terror of religious fanaticism gone wrong, the trusted spiritual leader revealed as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Jones represented the corruption of respectable society, the wealthy man whose civilized facade concealed murderous intentions. Mansfield was the dangerous outsider, the criminal element that threatened peaceful communities. Detective Wilkerson pursued Kelly with particular intensity, convinced that the minister's religious delusions had driven him to commit the murders as some twisted form of sacrifice. He pointed to Kelly's obsession with biblical passages about divine retribution and his history of erratic behavior around children. When Kelly was arrested in connection with similar murders in Colorado, Wilkerson believed he had found his killer. Meanwhile, local investigators continued to focus on Frank Jones, building a case based on business rivalry and personal animosity. They theorized that Jones had either committed the murders himself in a fit of rage or hired Mansfield to carry out the deed. The connection between Jones and Mansfield was tenuous but tantalizing. Both men had been in Villisca at the time of the murders, and Jones certainly had the money to hire a killer. The investigation became a three-way race to build cases against each suspect, with different law enforcement agencies pursuing different theories. The Burns Detective Agency focused on Kelly, local authorities investigated Jones, and federal agents looked into Mansfield's possible connections to other crimes. But as weeks turned to months, each promising lead seemed to crumble under scrutiny. Kelly's alibi for the night of the murders, while not airtight, was difficult to disprove. Jones's political connections helped shield him from the most aggressive investigative tactics. And Mansfield, despite his criminal background, had no clear motive for targeting the Moore family specifically. The three suspects became symbols of a frustrated investigation, each representing a different path that investigators hoped would lead to justice for 8 innocent victims. The wheels of justice turned slowly and chaotically in the aftermath of the Villisca murders. What followed was a series of trials, accusations, and legal proceedings that would ultimately prove as frustrating and inconclusive as the crime itself, leaving more questions than answers and destroying lives in their wake. Reverend Lynn George Jacobs Kelly became the primary focus of prosecution efforts when he was finally brought to trial in 1917, 5 years after the murders. The delay itself spoke to the complexity of building a case based largely on circumstantial evidence and psychological profiling, relatively new concepts in early 20th century criminal justice. The trial of Kelly was a media sensation that gripped Iowa and much of the nation. Prosecutors painted him as a religious fanatic whose twisted interpretation of biblical justice had driven him to murder an entire family. They presented evidence of his erratic behavior on the night of the murders, his hasty departure from Villisca, and his alleged confessions made to fellow inmates while in custody for other crimes. The prosecution's star witness was Detective James Newton Wilkerson, who had pursued Kelly relentlessly for years. Wilkerson testified about Kelly's pattern of appearing in towns shortly before axe murders occurred, creating what he called a trail of blood across the American Midwest. Similar murders in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Monmouth, Illinois, had all occurred after Kelly's appearances as a traveling minister. But Kelly's defense team, led by attorney W.E. Bartlett, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. They presented witnesses who testified that Kelly had been on the train leaving Villisca at the time the murders were believed to have occurred. They challenged the reliability of the alleged confessions, pointing out that Kelly had been under severe psychological stress and possibly suffering from mental illness when the statements were made. The defense also raised troubling questions about the investigation itself. The crime scene had been contaminated by hundreds of curiosity seekers. Evidence had been mishandled. Witness testimonies had been coached or influenced by the intensive media coverage. In the absence of physical evidence directly linking Kelly to the murders, the prosecution's case relied heavily on psychological profiling and circumstantial connections that proved insufficient for conviction. After days of testimony that laid bare the gruesome details of the murders for public consumption, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a verdict, not guilty. Kelly walked free, but his reputation was forever destroyed. He would spend the remainder of his life under a cloud of suspicion, never fully cleared in the court of public opinion despite his legal vindication. Frank Fernando Jones faced a different kind of justice, or injustice. Despite being the subject of intense suspicion and investigation, he never faced criminal charges for the Villisca murders. His wealth, political connections, and social standing provided him with protections that men like Kelly and Mansfield could never access. However, Jones paid a different price for the cloud of suspicion that surrounded him. His business relationships suffered as whispers of his potential involvement in the murders spread throughout Iowa's commercial circles. His political career, once promising, stagnated under the weight of public speculation about his role in the crime. While never convicted, Jones lived with the burden of suspicion until his death, his name forever linked to one of Iowa's most notorious unsolved cases. William Blackie Mansfield's fate was perhaps the most tragic of the three main suspects. Arrested multiple times in connection with the murders and other crimes, he spent years drifting in and out of jails and mental institutions. His life became a cycle of arrest, investigation, and release as authorities struggled to find concrete evidence linking him to the Villisca murders. Mansfield's drug addiction and criminal lifestyle made him an easy target for law enforcement agencies looking for someone to blame. He was questioned repeatedly about the murders, often under conditions that would be considered abusive by modern standards. The constant harassment and imprisonment took a severe toll on his already fragile mental state. The legal proceedings surrounding the Villisca murders exposed the limitations of early 20th century criminal investigation and prosecution. Without modern forensic techniques like DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, or sophisticated psychological profiling, investigators were forced to rely on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. The contamination of the crime scene by curiosity seekers made even basic physical evidence unreliable. The trials also revealed the class and social dynamics of 1912 America. Kelly, as a religious figure, was treated with initial deference that gradually turned to suspicion. Jones, as a wealthy and politically connected man, received protections that shielded him from the harshest investigative tactics. Mansfield, as a poor drifter with a criminal background, bore the brunt of law enforcement's frustration and became a convenient scapegoat for an unsolved crime. The failure to achieve convictions in the Villisca murders case left families, investigators, and the community with a profound sense of injustice. 8 innocent people had been brutally murdered, yet no one had been held accountable. The legal system had been tested and found wanting, unable to provide the closure and justice that such a horrific crime demanded. The Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street refused to let the dead rest in peace. In the years following the murders, the modest white clapboard structure became something far more sinister than a crime scene. It transformed into America's most notorious haunted house, where the boundary between historical tragedy and supernatural terror grew impossibly thin. After the trials concluded and the legal system had failed to provide justice, the house stood empty for years. No family wanted to live where 8 innocent people had been so brutally murdered. The property changed hands repeatedly, with each new owner discovering that the house carried a burden too heavy for normal domestic life to bear. The first reports of paranormal activity began almost immediately after the murders. Neighbors claimed to see lights moving through the darkened windows at night, despite the house being vacant. Children walking past on their way to school reported hearing the sounds of other children playing inside, laughter that would abruptly cut off when anyone approached too closely. Mrs. Darwin Lynn, who purchased the property in 1917, lasted only 6 months before fleeing in terror. She reported objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut without explanation, and most disturbing of all, the sounds of children crying in the upstairs bedrooms. She claimed to have seen the apparition of a small boy, whom she believed to be little Paul Moore, standing at the top of the staircase, reaching out as if pleading for help. The house's reputation grew with each failed attempt at habitation. Families would move in with the best of intentions, drawn by the property's low price and prime location, only to find themselves driven out by experiences they couldn't rationally explain. The pattern became so predictable that locals began betting on how long each new resident would last. In 1920, the Miller family attempted to make the house their home, convinced that tales of ghostly activity were merely superstitious nonsense. They lasted 3 weeks. Mrs. Miller reported awakening each night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the time investigators believed the murders had occurred, to the sound of someone walking through the house. When she would investigate, she found nothing but a pervasive sense of dread that made her skin crawl. The most terrifying incident occurred when the Miller's young daughter claimed that ghost children were playing in her bedroom. She described them in detail, 4 children and 2 older girls who wanted her to join their games, but disappeared whenever adults appeared. The daughter's description matched the Moore children and Stillinger girls with an accuracy that chilled her parents to the bone. Professional investigators of paranormal phenomena began visiting the house in the 1930s, drawn by its growing reputation as one of America's most authentically haunted locations. Their findings were consistently disturbing. Temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees occurred without explanation in specific rooms. Electromagnetic readings spiked dramatically in areas where the murders had taken place. Most unsettling of all, multiple investigators reported feeling the presence of children, scared, confused spirits who seemed trapped in an endless loop of that terrible night. Dr. Edgar Mormon, a psychiatrist who studied the psychological effects of violent crime scenes, spent several nights in the house during the 1940s. His clinical observations provided a chilling account of the house's atmosphere. He documented sounds of footsteps moving through the house in the same pattern investigators believed the killer had followed. He recorded sudden, inexplicable feelings of rage and violence that would overwhelm visitors in certain rooms, followed immediately by profound sadness. The house seemed to hold not just the spirits of the victims, but somehow the emotional residue of the crime itself. Visitors reported experiencing flashes of terror so intense they would flee without warning. Some claimed to have brief, nightmarish visions of the murders themselves, seeing shadowy figures moving through the rooms with violent intent. Local clergy attempted multiple times to bless or exorcise the house, but their efforts seemed only to intensify the paranormal activity. Reverend Thomas McKenna of the Presbyterian Church, the same denomination the Moore family had belonged to, spent one night in the house in 1952 and emerged the next morning convinced that some places were too saturated with evil to ever be fully cleansed. The children of Villisca grew up with the Moore house as their ultimate dare, the test of courage that separated the brave from the frightened. Generations of young people would sneak onto the property on Halloween night or during summer sleepovers, hoping to glimpse the famous ghosts. Most left quickly, unnerved by the house's oppressive atmosphere. Those who stayed longer often reported experiences that haunted them for years. By the 1960s, the house had achieved a kind of infamous celebrity status. True crime writers, paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers made pilgrimages to Villisca to experience the house where 8 people had died and, according to countless witnesses, never truly left. The tourism was macabre but undeniable. The house had become as much a part of American folklore as it was criminal history. The ghosts of the Moore family and Stillinger girls had achieved in death what they had never sought in life: immortality. Their spirits, trapped by violence and injustice, had transformed their former home into a monument to unsolved mystery and unexplained phenomena. More than 100 years have passed since that terrible night in Villisca. Yet the questions that haunted investigators in 1912 continue to perplex amateur sleuths, professional criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts today. The passage of time has not dulled the mystery. If anything, it has sharpened the edges of each unanswered question until they cut deeper than ever before. Modern forensic techniques have been applied retroactively to the evidence that survived the contaminated crime scene, but the results have been frustratingly inconclusive. DNA analysis of blood samples preserved from 1912 has yielded no matches to known suspects. Advanced crime scene reconstruction has confirmed the killer's methodical movement through the house, but provided no new insights into their identity or motive. The 3 primary suspects, Kelly, Jones, and Mansfield, have all been subjected to renewed scrutiny using contemporary investigative methods. Computer modeling of the timeline has strengthened Kelly's alibi while casting doubt on earlier witness testimonies. Financial records examined with modern forensic accounting techniques have found no evidence that Jones paid anyone to commit the murders. Mansfield's criminal history has been reanalyzed using current psychological profiling methods, revealing a pattern of petty crime and drug abuse, but no indicators of the kind of organized, methodical violence displayed at the Moore house. New suspects have emerged as researchers have combed through historical records with fresh eyes. Henry Lee Moore, a traveling serial killer whose crimes bore similarities to the Villisca murders, has been proposed as a possible perpetrator. His pattern of attacking families in their homes with axes or similar weapons across multiple states created what some modern investigators believe was a broader killing spree that included Villisca. The theory gained traction when researchers discovered that Henry Lee Moore had been in the Midwest during the summer of 1912 and had committed similar crimes both before and after the Villisca murders. His victims were typically families sleeping in their beds, attacked with axes or blunt instruments in the early morning hours. The systematic nature of his crimes matched the methodical approach used in Villisca. Another suspect who has gained attention is Andy Sawyer, a man who worked for the railroad and would have had the means and opportunity to travel between towns where similar murders occurred. Sawyer allegedly confessed to the Villisca murders on his deathbed in the 1950s, but the reliability of deathbed confessions and the lack of corroborating evidence has left this theory in the realm of speculation. The internet age has brought new energy to the investigation, with online communities of amateur detectives sharing theories, analyzing evidence, and proposing solutions to the century-old mystery. Websites dedicated to the Villisca murders attract thousands of visitors who pore over crime scene photographs, witness testimonies, and court transcripts with obsessive attention to detail. Some modern theories have focused on the possibility that the murders were committed by someone within the Villisca community who has never been seriously considered as a suspect. These investigators point to the killer's intimate knowledge of the house layout, the personal nature of some aspects of the crime, and the way the murderer was able to move through the small town without detection. The covered mirrors continue to fascinate modern criminologists and psychologists. Current theories about this behavior range from practical explanations, the killer didn't want to be seen or identified by their own reflection, to psychological ones suggesting severe mental illness, guilt, or adherence to specific cultural or religious beliefs about death and mirrors. The advancement of genealogical DNA testing has opened new possibilities for solving cold cases, and the Villisca murders have not been forgotten. However, the degraded state of the evidence and the contamination of the crime scene in 1912 have limited the effectiveness of these modern techniques. Still, Investigators remain hopeful that new developments in DNA analysis might eventually provide the breakthrough that has eluded them for more than a century. The case has inspired countless books, documentaries, and even fictional adaptations, each offering new theories or perspectives on the unsolved mystery. Academic criminologists have used the Villisca murders as a case study in the evolution of criminal investigation techniques, highlighting how the limitations of early 20th century forensic science contributed to the failure to solve the case. What remains consistent across all modern investigations is the recognition that the Villisca murders represent something profoundly disturbing about human nature. The systematic destruction of an entire family, including small children, speaks to a level of evil that transcends simple motives like robbery or revenge. The killer's actions after the murders, the covered mirrors, the methodical search, the staged weapon, suggest a psychology so twisted that it defies easy categorization even by today's standards. The Moore family and Stillinger girls deserve justice, and the passage of time has not diminished that moral imperative. Each new generation of investigators brings fresh perspectives and techniques to the case, driven by the hope that somewhere in the accumulated evidence lies the key to finally answering the questions that have haunted Villisca for more than a century. The truth about what happened on that June night in 1912 remains as elusive as ever, but the search continues. Today, at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, the Moore house stands as both monument and mystery, its white clapboard siding weathered by more than a century of seasons, but its dark secret preserved with meticulous care. The building that once sheltered a loving family has been transformed into something unprecedented in American history. A crime scene preserved as a living museum, where visitors can walk through the rooms where 8 people met their violent end. The house's current incarnation began in 1994 when Darwin and Martha Lynn, descendants of the family who briefly owned the property in the 1920s, purchased the structure with the intention of preserving it as a historical site. Their goal was not to sensationalize the tragedy, but to honor the memory of the victims while providing a place where the mystery could be studied and perhaps, someday, finally solved. The restoration process was both painstaking and unsettling. Original floorboards stained with blood from 1912 were preserved under protective glass. The rooms were furnished with period-appropriate pieces, many of them original to the Moore family. The axe, the actual weapon used in the murders, was returned to its position leaning against the wall in the guest bedroom, a chilling reminder of the violence that had unfolded within these walls. Visitors who tour the house today often comment on the atmosphere that pervades the structure. Even in broad daylight, with tour guides explaining the historical context, there's an undeniable heaviness to the air, a sense that the house itself remembers what happened here. Many visitors report feeling overwhelmed by sadness in the children's bedrooms, while others describe an inexplicable sense of unease that follows them throughout their visit. The house has become a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts from around the world. Tour groups arrive daily, drawn by the opportunity to stand in the actual rooms where one of America's most famous unsolved murders occurred. The guides, well-versed in both the historical facts and the various theories about the crime, present the evidence without favoring any particular suspect or solution, allowing visitors to form their own conclusions about what might have happened that terrible night. Paranormal investigators continue to flock to the house, armed with modern ghost hunting equipment and decades of reported supernatural activity to investigate. The current owners accommodate these investigations, recognizing that the paranormal aspect of the house has become inseparable from its historical significance. Night tours and overnight stays are available for those brave enough to spend extended time in what many consider America's most haunted house. The electromagnetic anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and unexplained sounds that have been reported for decades continue to occur with startling regularity. Modern digital equipment has captured audio recordings of children's voices in empty rooms, photographic anomalies that suggest the presence of figures not visible to the naked eye, and electronic voice phenomena that seem to respond to direct questions about the murders. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The house serves a purpose beyond tourism and paranormal investigation. It functions as an active research facility where new evidence and theories about the murders can be examined and tested. Crime scene reconstruction experts, forensic specialists, and criminal psychologists regularly visit to study the layout and evidence, hoping that fresh eyes and new techniques might finally unlock the secret that has eluded investigators for more than a century. The bedrooms where the children died have been preserved exactly as they were found, down to the positioning of the beds and the bloodstains on the walls. Standing in these rooms, visitors often struggle to comprehend how anyone could have committed such an act against innocent children. The humanity of the victims becomes impossible to ignore when confronted with their actual living space. Paul's toys still scattered about, Catherine's school books on her dresser, Herman's clothes hanging in the closet. The Moore house has achieved something remarkable in the annals of American crime. It has kept a century-old murder case alive in the public consciousness through the simple power of place. Unlike cases that fade from memory as evidence degrades and witnesses die, the Villisca murders remain immediate and visceral because the scene of the crime continues to exist, preserved in horrifying detail. Local residents have long since grown accustomed to the stream of visitors who make their way to East 2nd Street, but the impact of the house on the community remains complex. Some view it as an important historical preservation that honors the victims and keeps their memory alive. Others question the appropriateness of turning a site of such tragedy into a tourist destination, arguing that it commercializes suffering and turns real people's deaths into entertainment. The house stands as a testament to the enduring power of unsolved mystery. More than a century after 8 innocent people were murdered in their sleep, the questions surrounding their deaths continue to fascinate, horrify, and perplex new generations of investigators and visitors. The building itself has become both evidence and memorial, crime scene and shrine. As the sun sets over Villisca each evening, casting long shadows across East 2nd Street, the house at 508 continues its silent vigil. Within its walls, the past and present coexist in ways that challenge our understanding of time, memory, and justice. The Moore family and Stillinger girls may be gone, but their story lives on, preserved in wood and stone, waiting for the day when someone might finally provide the answers that have eluded us for more than 100 years. The house still stands, and with it, the hope that justice delayed might not forever be justice denied.